Hello everyone, Fairtime here, and welcome back to CIA. This is a video series where I take a look at a game that's currently in development, and give in-depth analysis on the various aspects of it to build interest around the game and give feedback to the developer. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Teufel the Corrupted One, developed by Barvix, another fellow member of the GMC. Also, before we begin, I was told that my previous one of these videos was a bit on the long side, so I decided to revise this one to keep it more concise and focused. As usual, let me start out with some disclaimers. This version of the game that we'll be looking at is not, nor was it claimed to be, a finished product. Next, if I don't mention something in the video or don't explicitly commend it, that probably means it's fine, or is of a much lower priority for me to bring to the developer's attention. As a result, this may make the video seem overly negative despite an overall positive outlook on the game. Also, to the developer, my opinion is but one of many, and my personal experience with the game may not reflect the experience of all players. Please do not interpret my word as law. I'm sure you've heard this sort of thing before. I'll be staying as objective as possible throughout the overview, unless what I'm saying is explicitly stated to be my subjective opinion. With that, let's get into the analysis. So did I enjoy what content is currently on offer within Teufel the Corrupted One? Did its positive aspects outweigh the negative? Well, mostly. Like usual with these kinds of things, there are some problems with this version of the game that will assumedly be fixed in later stages of development simply by virtue of regular development moving forward. However, there are some objective issues in addition to this that wouldn't necessarily be solved in that way. That said though, I think the game is still on the right track, if the past two versions are anything to go by. Now I have to say, it may be that I haven't worked with music in Game Maker Studio very extensively, or perhaps it's just me personally, but it seems that all these early in development Game Maker Studio games have some kind of issue with the music being too loud. This game is no exception. This was not just the case in the first version I played, but also in the most recent update of the game. Luckily, the music is fitting and works given the setting and tone of the game that the developer wishes to convey, so the volume doesn't end up being too annoying, but it's still worth noting. Overall, the music is fairly high quality stuff, in the sense that it fits with the theme, and sounds a bit like a newer take on what the game is trying to emulate. However, I'd still appreciate the ability to modify the music volume in-game. Also, the music doesn't seem to loop right. It'll cut off abruptly and then restart when you're in one area for too long. Also, the boss battle areas just keep using the same music as previous areas, which doesn't really contribute to the action. But anyway, perhaps the music just seemed loud, because you'll notice when you play this, there's very little other sound in the game. There are basically two other sound effects, and there aren't even any in the menus or anything. This is a real issue that not only affects the first impression, where I basically noticed right off the bat that it was unusually quiet, but it also factors into gameplay, which I'll explain soon. Now, unlike last time, this game isn't part of a genre that I lack skill or experience with. In fact, it's hard to lack skill in a game like this. Teufel is quite obviously inspired by the Legend of Zelda games, specifically the earlier ones for the NES and SNES. The gameplay of this falls somewhere between the original Legend of Zelda and A Link to the Past, though it's not quite directly comparable to either. The game employs a pixelated art style, which, from other reviews and comments, seems to be the subject of some criticism. I gotta say, I don't really understand these criticisms. I mean, it's not like we're looking for the Mona Lisa here, it's a retro-style game. And though it's not really the best pixel art I've ever seen, it does the job, for the most part. It's all fairly low-res, simplistic stuff as you'd expect, and it doesn't really fail in allowing you to tell the difference between key characters, areas, and props, but it's not gonna wow you to any huge degree. Or at all, really. Especially the repeating textures like grass, water, and sand, which are really just large lattices of two repeating pixel colors, which is not really appealing objectively or subjectively. To be fair, it is all consistent in and of itself, though possibly overly so, in the sense that you're going to be seeing a lot of the same houses, signs, trees, and props over and over, despite varying environments and locales in the overworlds. The biggest issue I take with the art is that, in a lot of places, you're not actually getting the visual feedback you need. This mostly happens with the animations, and usually in combat scenarios. For example, take a look at this fairly mundane interaction on screen. You can see the player character moving toward an enemy. The first problem here is the lack of a real animation with the player's weapons. I mean, even in the original Legend of Zelda game on the original NES, there was some indication that Link was swinging in a sword, and that stance was reflected in the sprite. However, in Teufel, The sword just flat out appears, not really even in the player's hand, but just sort of overlaid onto the sprite. Even if it's just kept as a single frame in the final version, I'd like to see some indication in the sprite that the character is actually holding a sword and attacking with it. This might sound a bit subjective, since you could construe that the sound of the sword swinging, the sound of hitting an enemy, and the sword simply appearing are all adequate feedback for the gameplay. However, it still comes off as somewhat low effort if the only visual indication that the character is attacking is that the weapon just appears next to him. I only say this because I know that first impressions are key, and if these issues are present in the final release, it will drive people away. There are a few other examples of this kind of thing being present, but those relate more directly to gameplay, so I'll discuss that in a bit. But on the whole, presentation and asset quality are mostly solid and consistent, if somewhat repetitive. Though some areas currently lack key feedback to the player, namely in combat, and once again we'll discuss a little more of that later. For now, let's get into gameplay. So if you've ever played the two original Zelda RPGs, you basically know what kind of experience you're getting into here. You start off being greeted by a basic story cutscene, then tossed in to freely roam around, talk to NPCs, attack enemies, and enter different zones. You can also enter into buildings as well as dungeons, the latter of which contain enemies, bosses, and sometimes a sort of puzzle section that you'll have to solve. Now, I'm not going to completely criticize the game for trying to be like Zelda or try to debate whether or not the Zelda games really are RPGs. This honestly does feel like a game that's trying to emulate the Zelda games, and as such, a lot of fundamental criticisms wouldn't really be directed at this game, but more at the Zelda formula. So for now, I'll stay away from that, and focus on what this game is doing on its own merits. Mainly what you'll be doing in this game is moving around the environment, fetching things for NPCs, and fighting your way through the various enemies in the game. Now, I've already expressed my dislike of the melee-style enemies in this game due to the lack of feedback, and I somewhat also expressed my concerns with the player melee combat, but I want to go more into the sword mechanics here. Like I said, the combat does lack some elements of feedback, which, as before, could be at least partially solved by giving more of a visual indication that you're attacking, rather than just the simple apparition of a sword or bow upon the character sprite. Like I also said earlier, there's barely any sound outside the music, only a sword swing and a hit on the enemy. Adding sounds and animations for an enemy melee attacking, or when you fire an arrow or take damage would be nice. But with that, let's keep a couple of things in mind. First off, I didn't see this in the newest version, but in the previous version, there was no animation for an enemy actually melee attacking, only the mere gradual apparition of a white semicircle around them. That's not what should happen. Instead, if that's the style you want to go for with melee, instead of simple collision-based melee like the game has now, then make an actual melee animation for the character. Also, keep in mind, not everything would need a sound associated with it, considering the amount of projectiles at certain times might make that annoying, but some indication as to when these things are happening would be great. The melee attacks just devolve into basically bayonet charging people or standing next to them and mashing the X button. Ranged attacks are basically just mashing the X button or holding and then releasing the X button at the right time. Once again, following the Zelda formula for this kind of basic combat isn't the worst thing in the world. The whole bayonet charging thing is fine, spamming the button is just sort of the way this combat works, and it's obvious that combat itself is not the central pillar here. But when you get situations like the one on screen now, where you have to use your sword to deflect incoming projectiles, the system's flaws rear their ugly head. The deflection hitbox isn't really defined, meaning you can get hit by a projectile that you're clearly actively deflecting and still get hurt or even die. Considering this is your main means of defense against enemy projectiles, this needs to be worked on. This means that you can also be swinging your sword at an enemy, have it collide with the enemy, and nothing will happen. These are just bugs, but they pop up in combat often enough for them to be of note. Anyway, let's start looking past the combat. The game is said to be a Zelda-like RPG, once again bringing up whether or not the Zelda games really are RPGs, but I digress. It has the movement, it has the music, and to a degree, it has the atmosphere. There are a lot of cool things around the world, like these gravestones that have epitaphs on them, demonic symbols and imagery on the floor and all around this place. The bosses all look fairly interesting. There are just two main problems I have with the gameplay, and both of these are probably going to be solved simply by development proceeding normally. The first problem is that there's a lack of things to do within the overworlds, and the things that there are simply formulaic or cliché. This is of course outside of the dungeons. NPCs will just spew out a few dialogue lines and or prompt you to go fetch something for them, after which you simply run over there, collide with the object, maybe dispatch a couple enemies, then just run back and do the same sort of thing again several times. Certainly that's not the reason anyone I know plays the Zelda games. This, combined with the parts of the game where it just throws a ton of spammy enemies at you, even sometimes spawning them around you randomly, can be really frustrating. Before I describe my second main problem with the game, I'd like to add that I feel adding some element to encourage traversal and exploration beyond simply advancing your ability to go through the story would greatly benefit this game and the lore behind it. Granted, this element has been improved since the last version, so it seems to be going in the right direction, but adding maybe some kind of collectibles or more things to expand on the backstory around the world would make the game more immersive. This would also give people not just a reason to continue playing, but also to replay the game. Now, my second main problem with the game might come off as a bit subjective, so fair warning. The game seems to lack focus. I have no idea what the central element of this game is supposed to be. What draws me to play this game and keep playing it instead of just saying, all this game does is make me want to play Zelda? It doesn't seem to be the story, since that's fairly minimal at this point. It's certainly not the combat. Exploration elements don't seem to be all that fleshed out yet, if they were even intended to be so fleshed out in the first place, and the RPG elements are also not that fleshed out either. The strongest things right now seem to be the game's atmosphere and those dungeons I mentioned earlier, whether they be the ones with the bosses or puzzles. Now you may be thinking, well, there you go, there's the elements that are going to keep you playing. But I don't think that the developer intended for these to be the central elements. However, as it stands, the dungeons are above the atmosphere even. They offer varied locales, puzzles, unique environments. This is a stark contrast to the overworld segments that are so mundane and played out. Even this one on screen right now that has a very tedious puzzle was better than the overworld segments. It was just a nice change of pace. I think that the developer should stay on track with what they're doing in these two elements, and put in more sound and feedback for the player, as well as find ways to reward exploration a bit more, along with normal bug fixes. However, seeing the improvements that this version has over the previous version gives me hope. If I had done the video on the previous version of this game, I wouldn't have been quite so kind. So as for just other things that I wanted to mention at the end that I think are worth adding, different weapons and armor that you can collect in the game are very cool. I definitely want to see more of those and definitely want to see what variety they have. The premise and backstory of this game are also very interesting. That factors into the sort of atmosphere part that I was talking about earlier. And they are still kind of minimal, so I would like to see more of that. Also, it is worth noting that this game has no manual save system, which I personally think is a staple in games like this. And also, there's no options menu, and most of all, no exit button, which is pretty annoying. Finally, I'd just like to give my final thoughts on the game as it stands now. Let me make it clear. I think the game is on the right track so far. I've had the opportunity to play two different versions of the game, and from that, I can see the developer added and fixed quite a bit in the most recent update. Definitely, this leads me to believe that the game can add new things and fix some of the existing issues in later iterations. Like I said, if I had made this video in regards to the previous version of the game, I wouldn't have had as much positive to say about it. I think the biggest issues are player feedback during combat, which was once again something that's improved since the last version, lack of exploratory encouragement and varied missions in the overworlds, which could be inherently fixed later on in development, and the lack of focus that I mentioned, which could, once again, be inherently fixed by investing more time into development of those areas. Also, there would be routine bug fixes as well, I would hope. Unlike in my last CIA, I've been able to see multiple in-development versions of this game, and that's given me the rare opportunity to see how the game is progressing while in development. That alone has greatly increased my positivity toward the game. I can see that it's progressing quite nicely, and despite being a very blatant Zelda clone, I'm confident in the game that it will eventually become. I'll be keeping a close eye on this one, and when a newer version is released that adds or changes enough, I'll be sure to make another video detailing my thoughts on that. Make sure to download and try it for yourself at the GameJolt or itch.io links in the description, and then use the next link to head over to the GMC thread and let the developer know what you think. But with that, thank you all for watching. Fairtime out.